My name's David Baker. I'm chairman of the Biblical Studies Department at Ashland Theological Seminary this year. And as part of our conversations with faculty, we've had good representation for biblical studies. There have been other departments involved as well, but we're honored this evening to have a presentation by my esteemed colleague, Dr. Paul Overland. As you can see, is professor of Old Testament and Semitic languages here at the seminary. And his topic will be mining Proverbs for all it's worth. And it's an appropriate topic for him because just recently a massive commentary on Proverbs has come out under his name. We thank him for that. So we welcome him to make this presentation. And in the past, we've asked folks, if you have questions, you can pose them in the chat down below, but the numbers might be small enough that at the end during a question and answer period, you could just ask them personally. But if you'd like to start putting them in the chat, and then I'll kind of MC them. So Dr. Overland won't have to keep his eye on two things at once. But again, we welcome you, Paul, and I'll stop sharing my screen, let you share yours.
We're entitling Mining Proverbs for All It's Worth. You're here tonight already because Proverbs is meaningful to you. It's not as though you're going to discover things for the first time, but it's become my conviction that there is so much more in this very, very compact book, which, as we understand better how it holds together, that we'll be able to get more richness out of it. So exponentially more richness. How do we do that? By noticing that there are individual sayings that are actually couched, embedded within poems. And this will be the main tipping point, particularly in the portion of Proverbs that runs from chapters 10 through 29. We see poems more easily in the front end, chapters 1 through 9. And that's why in step B, we'll be dipping into Proverbs 1 through 9 to see how the more obvious poems are put together and then apply those insights in the deeper water, the portions of Proverbs where it's more difficult to see the poems. And then in step C, we'll ask the questions, well, what do we do with a single, solitary saying? How can a reading of one portion be enriched by virtue of seeing how it has a network within its individual poem? Finally, step D, if we can identify a series of poems going one after another through the book, can this help us get a bird's eye view, a sense that the sage, the wise persons of Israel, and there are several authors named, as you may recall, within the book of Proverbs, can we get a sense that they're going somewhere, almost a curriculum? That's where we'll be heading. Right. Last summer, my wife, Lori, and I, who was also attending tonight, so I'll get some around the dinner table feedback, I'm sure, valuably. She's been my proofreader on much of this. Last summer, Lori and I visited our daughter and son-in-law in Seattle. While we were there, I noticed a beautiful book on their coffee table. It's called The How and Why of Woodworking by Michael Pekovich. It's filled with concise explanations, some beautiful pictures of craftsmanship. But when I opened to the introduction, I encountered something I wasn't expecting. As I began to read it, I felt that I could have written the same words, although it wouldn't have been about woodcraft. Here are a few lines. Pekovich writes, "This endeavor began with two questions. Does the world actually need another woodworking book? Think, does the world actually need another Proverbs commentary? Don't we have enough already? And what exactly do I have to contribute," he writes, "to the conversation?" He continues, "I decided the answer to the first question, does it need another woodworking book, had a lot to do with my ability to answer the second question, do I have something to contribute?" He goes on, "I've been about this craft, woodworking, for about 30 years or so, and I'm as passionate about it now as I ever have been. More to the point, I'm having more fun and I'm happier with the results of my efforts now than ever before. Well, it's taken me a while to get there. I don't think it necessarily has to take that long for you. And that's why I'm here. End of quote. I feel much the same about the study of Proverbs. And my hope is that the study I've had opportunity to do over the years will save you time to dig in more deeply. Our starting point is to acknowledge that there's a problem with Proverbs, particularly chapters 10 through 29. If we're honest with ourselves, when reading those chapters, most of us would not say, I'm having the time of my life. I'm understanding these sayings, how they work together. Instead, the sayings, beautiful as they are individually, they're rather like a bucket of loose, lustrous pearls, high on density, packed together in a bucket, but low on design, that is, one interacting with another. The way we typically solve this problem of high density and low design is to appreciate each pearl of wisdom, each proverb, as a solitary gem. It'd be interesting to know which are some of your favorites. You probably have some gems, as I do, that have become favorites. So we appreciate each one, and then we export. That is, we take a single saying out of its setting within Proverbs, and we pull it over into our life. We pull it over, maybe compare it with another passage of scripture. And consequently, within the territory of Proverbs, we rather lift this customary ban of ours, which says, don't do proof texting, don't cherry pick scriptures out of their setting. We allow that instead for Proverbs. Why is that? Is it not because, as far as we can see, those, particularly the 20 chapters from Proverbs 10 through 29, those chapters appear to form a disconnected collection of sayings. And as the folklore scholar Wolfgang Mieder has observed, the proverb in a, shall we insert, mere collection is dead. What he's getting at is we're unable to recover the full meaning of a saying when it has no vital link to its surroundings. But what if instead these pearls of wisdom, densely piled together, seemingly with no rhyme or reason, what if instead, right there as they are, they possess design and have had that design all along? Now, by design, what I'm referring to is a sense of purposeful, poetic cohesion among several sayings next to each other, that they're going somewhere, they're purposely sequenced. Now, to make a suggestion like that, we'd want to ask naturally, well, do we have evidence of poems elsewhere in the book? And rapidly, we would come up with a list, perhaps this one, and there are more that I have not included. These happens to be from, as you see, from Proverbs 1 through 9. Early on in chapter 1, we have a gang that's trying to get their talons into the young person and enroll them into their murderous plans. And the father responds, no, don't join the gang. That's a poem. And then right on the heels of that, chapter 1, beginning in verse 20, we find Lady Wisdom, this poetic figure, shows up and said, if you're not going to join the gang, you need to be joining as my disciple, a wisdom disciple. That's a poem. Chapter 2 lists the benefits of wisdom, and on it goes. All this to say, we already know that the sage, that is the authors of Proverbs, Solomon, and the others that are named there, the sage used poems to convey sequences of ideas. So it's there. The question is, where are they when we get out into chapters 10 through 29? The problem then, as I see it, is not so much a problem with Proverbs as it is a problem with me, myself as a reader. That is to say, are my glasses tuned in? Are they clean enough so that I can actually see poems that are already there? What we need then is to read Proverbs as if it were alongside Solomon and ask him to show us, where are the poems? Where are these sequences of thought? A moment ago, we saw a list of several poems in Proverbs, the ones that are more easily recognized. And we noticed that they're located primarily in what I would call the shallow end. They're on the left side of the screen, that is chapters 1 through 9. But when we cross into chapter 10, there's ample evidence that poems are still present. They're just crafted more subtly with greater poetic sophistication. They're feathered in so that we may not see where they start and stop and how they hold together quite as easily. Here's what I think is going on. I believe that those more obvious poems on the front end of the book, besides conveying the actual content that they have, they're like a primer to help us understand how the sage put poems together, in the hopes that once we get used to that, when we move into the deep end, the center section, 10 to 29, we would watch for some of those same techniques, those signals, where a poem starts, where it stops, and how it holds together, and be able to recognize that. Interestingly enough, when we get to the far end of the book on the right, chapters 30 and 31, once again, the poems get much simpler. It's as if they get very, very shallow. In fact, the very last one about the noble woman, the valorous woman, the last half of chapter 31, this is what we call an alphabetic acrostic. There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. There are 22 verses in that poem. Each successive verse starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So it's a highly structured, it's a very, very obvious poem. All right. Here are the things then that we can watch and learn from Proverbs 1 through 9 about how the sages composed poems. There are ways that they started poems, the beginnings, and that's item 1. There are ways that the poem holds together in the middle, in its middle, the internal coherence, that's items 2, 3, and 4. And then ways that they, as if it were tools they could draw from in order to close out a poem, 5, 6, and 7. Not every one of these shows up in every poem. It's rather a menu from which they could draw and utilize to fashion the poems. We'll start out by watching how they do this in Proverbs 1 through 9. We'll draw some examples. And then we'll be turning to Proverbs, the end of chapter 10 and chapter 11. I would encourage you, if you have a copy of the Bible handy, go ahead and have it ready to open to chapter 10, verse 31. That is the very end of Proverbs 10. That'll come a bit later. But first in the shallow end. So here is a technique that the sage, the poet, often uses to signal a poem or a portion within a poem is about to begin. We could call this the wisdom commendation, and that is the sage saying, I commend wisdom to you. I'm saying that wisdom is something worthwhile. I recommend wisdom to you. That's how we're using the term of wisdom commendation. A wisdom commendation then establishes the worth of wisdom, but it does not issue situation-specific advice. Like if you find yourself in this situation, here's what you should do. It doesn't have that. It just, the one thing it will say, it will recommend getting wisdom, but I think we can agree that is commending wisdom itself. What comes after wisdom commendation then is the wisdom content. And you see that labeled here off to the left in verses 3 and 4. This is where we get into situation-specific advice. I love it when I walk into the kitchen and I smell the amazing aromas of spaghetti sauce simmering or chicken soup or a roast. The aroma is not the meal, but I know that a meal is about to begin and it whets my appetite. That's what the sage is doing when he inserts a wisdom commendation. It's the aroma before the lecture. The lecture is the wisdom content itself. So we've looked at wisdom commendations. Let's move now to step 2, the component that we can call thematic cohesion. Thematic cohesion. Thematic cohesion is at work when we encounter words or concepts that keep popping up in a group of sayings that are next to each other. So a string of however many, maybe just 2 or 3, maybe quite a few sayings that are next to each other. Here's a sample. You can see it comes from Proverbs 1, 10 to 19. This is the appeal from the gang of thugs who are trying to recruit the young person. And then the father in the second half protests and says, no, don't be part of it. The words that are underlined and in red then speak to this theme of getting wealth by brutality. So using violence to get rich. We won't pause to read it all, but as you scan over them, I trust you're picking up words that, oh, that's brutal, or oh, I can see they're talking about getting rich. We'll keep going now. That was thematic cohesion. If you're wondering, does this technique show up elsewhere? These are all of these, except perhaps wisdom commendations, will show up in much poetry. We could go to Psalm 23, and you know that there's imagery about the shepherd. That's thematic cohesion, the shepherd and the sheep, giving cohesion to parts of that, much, if not all, of that poem. Next is something we call the palistrophe. Palistrophe. What this is a sequence of sayings that move in one direction and then pivot and then back down. It's almost like climbing a mountain. We'll come back to that in just a minute. It can also be known as an extended chiasm. Proverbs chapter 1 actually contains 2 of these, and here is the first. Once again, we're still looking at that passage with the gang that's trying to recruit the young person. We'll take time to walk through this. If we focus on the outline headings on the right side, then we'll be able to see how the topics move sequentially, moving 1 through 3, and then they turn around at verse 15 and go 3, 2, 1. That's the palistrophic reversal. So step 1, that would be the top band in blue and also the bottom band in blue. Here we have the gang's murderous strategy, verses 11 and 12. That's countered in 17 and 18 at the bottom by the parent as he exposes the suicidal outcomes of their strategy. Step 2, that's the beige zone. The gang accounts for their strategy, their plan to commit murder, using this rationale. They say, it's a good idea because we're going to gain monetary ends. That's what we get out of it. The parent in verse 16 counters with his own rationale. In his case, it's a rationale why the young person should exercise caution. And he says it's because the gang stoops to violent means in order to gain their monetary ends. The green zone is at the core, and incidentally, in a palistrophe, we understand that the Hebrew poets wanted us to pay particular attention to whatever is at the core. In this case, it's 2 verses. Sometimes it's a single verse that's the pivot point. Here in the green zone, we find the thugs bring their strategy and their rationale to a climax by issuing a forceful call for the youth to join their gang. Cast your lot in with us, we hear them say. That's verse 14. And instantly, the parent counters in verse 15. He issues an equally passionate plea for his son to dissociate from them and to do that without delay. The effect of a palistrophe, and one of the things we want to get a feel for, is how do these structures, these techniques, what do they contribute to the energy and the flow, the dynamism of a poem? You could think of a palistrophe like climbing up and back down a mountain. You ascend one side, and then you pause at the summit long enough to enjoy the spectacular view. That's the pivot point that's especially powerful in a palistrophe. And then you reverse your path, revisiting some of the same scenery as you go back down. In addition to thematic cohesion and palistrophes, another technique that we find the wise poets using is a multiple theme introduction. This is such a simple but a beautiful, beautiful technique. It's one that speakers use routinely. If you've heard a speech and someone says, I'm going to talk to you about these 3 things, and then they launch and there are the 3 things, one after the other, that they expand on. So a compact introduction and then an expansion. That's what we mean by a multiple theme introduction. Still in chapter 1, here we find a dual theme introduction, looking at the right column, enticement, and then followed by warning. The enticement is cast as an if part of a conditional statement. The warning is the then part of the statement. So notice in the wording there to the left. My son, if sinners should begin to persuade you, then, in brackets, do not go. That's all compactly presented in verse 10. Immediately in verse 11, notice that once again we encounter the if. If they say, this is the expansion of 10a. That expansion continues through 11, 12, 13, and 14. Not all that's produced on the screen. When we come to 15, we get the then expansion. My son, in brackets, then do not walk along the lane with them. That language is very similar to 10b, do not go. So we call that multiple theme introduction. What we're driving at with particularly this internal coherence is cultivating our ability to come into a poem and say, oh, these are not just isolated, disconnected gems, little pearls that are not connected to each other. If we notice thematic cohesion, the same kind of concept running through it, or if we notice an artistic palistrophe, or if we notice a couple themes mentioned early, and then they show up later in sequential kind of expansion, you can say, these things really belong together, and we're supposed to read them as a cohesive whole. Now we come to endings. Step 5, a character summary. Here's an example later in the Proverbs 1 through 9 zone. We're looking at chapter 9, verse 12. If you have been wise, you have been wise for yourself. But if you have been scoffing, you alone must bear the consequences. I need to explain what's going on here. Chapter 9 is where you have two competing banquet invitations. Lady Wisdom says, come to my banquet and I will feed you. What she will feed will actually be wisdom instruction. And then Dame Folly says, oh, come to my banquet. And the banquet invitation language is basically identical, but she does not have a good banquet. She has stolen food. And she says, oh, but it's really, really exciting to eat this stuff. Kind of paraphrasing that. But unfortunately, her guests wind up dead. It's a fatal banquet. Where's chapter 9, verse 12 coming? This comes at the end of Lady Wisdom's portion. So it's compressing in a moralizing tone, either one or two contrasting characters, either one character or two contrasting characters. Here we have two different ones. If you've been wise on the one hand, or if you've been scoffing. Character summary is a technique often used to signal the close of a poem or a portion of a poem. Another technique is intensification. Intensification. We're turning back now to the poem about the gang that's inviting the youth, and the father saying, don't go with them. Verse 19 in chapter 1 is the very end of that. The father has finished saying, don't join them. Actually, this is the verse he uses to finish that. And he says, such are the ways of every ruthless profiteer. The life of its masters shall it take. The concept there, and I should comment, the translations that you're seeing here are my own translations. The concept here is that if someone uses ruthless methods, it's almost like they've got an attack dog on a leash, and the ruthless methods are their attack dog. But eventually, Solomon says, those masters of that vicious animal, those masters will actually become the victims, because the life of the masters shall it, that ruthless technique that use the image of an attack dog, it will turn on the masters and they will be ruined. Intensification here comes with the vividness of the language, like ruthless, and life, mortal risk, death in the phrase it shall take, and in that word every, that's a word of universality. So this is a technique that we can become sensitive to, and by recognizing it, realize that the sage is leading towards conclusion. The last item that we'll notice here, fostering conclusion, is closure. The concept of closure is to notice at the end of a poem how many words or concepts have already figured into an earlier portion of the poem. Once again, we're looking at that same invitation of the gang. At the bottom of the screen is that same verse 19, and now you can see it's highlighted as the conclusion. Here's what we're trying to convey by the colored letters with the underscoring, particularly in verse 19. Every colored letter or every colored word has already appeared, either the literal word or the concept, earlier in the poem. Consequently, we could call verse 19 a closure-rich verse. It's very, very dense with concepts already used. Very effective way to conclude a presentation. And so we've seen these various techniques, whether it's the wisdom commendation, which prepares someone for something to come, like a kitchen aroma, whether it's thematic cohesion, and you could think of this like a field of strawberries. Looking out over a field, it's all strawberries, it holds together, but there's no distinction between them. A palistrophe, which is like climbing a summit and then descending back down. Multiple theme introduction, it's like someone saying, I'm going to talk to you about, like a tour guide, we're going to show you some museums and restaurants in this famous city. And then they go out and they actually do that. They show you some museums and some restaurants. Character summary, I think of this like a flight attendant in an airplane who says, I'd like everyone to return your seats to the upright position and close and lock your tray tables. As soon as you hear that, you know the flight's about to land. When we encounter one of those moralizing character summaries, it's a tip-off that the flight, the lecture, the poem is about to end. The intensification used a very vivid language. This is like a drum roll at the end of a symphony. Closure, that's where all those words coalesce together in the very last verse. That's like a fireworks show. Instead of just an occasional orange burst or a red burst or green or a waterfall, you get all of them just erupting all at once, just crowding over each other in the grand finale of the fireworks. That's what the closure makes me think of. And as we use those images, I hope you caught some of the sense, some of the emotion that accompanies those. These are techniques of the sage to infuse dynamism and emotion into the composition. So we've noticed these techniques in the shallow waters. What we want to do now is move over into the deep waters. And here's where we'll begin referencing parts of the end of Proverbs 10 through chapter 11, verse 31. Before we do that, I'm going to put a pause here and just inquire if any may have questions. Perhaps some have already been typed in. If there are any of that sort, I'd be glad to respond to those. And since clearing up any questions may make it easier for people to navigate the rest of our presentation.
I don't see anything in the chat, but there might be some that folks, they could just unmute themselves and ask.
That would be fine. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, hearing none, we'll forge ahead and maybe some at the close. Earlier, we saw that wisdom commendation is a way that the sage can signal the beginning of a portion. Notice that this selection now is coming from chapter 10, verses 31 and 32. And then when we come to chapter 11, verse 1 that you see in the lower portion of the screen, that's the very next verse. There's a chapter break has been inserted by the medieval chapter inserter. And what we're wanting to do is cultivate a sense of where Solomon, where the sages would have put their chapter breaks, not the same as where the medieval person in many cases. What are the signals of this being a wisdom commendation? In verses 31 and 2, it's the underscored words. A moral person's mouth will bear fruit of wisdom. A perverse tongue will be cut off. Lips of a moral person will thoroughly know approval, but the mouth of guilty folk, perversion. Those underscored words pertain to wisdom explicitly or to speech. When we get down to chapter 11, verse 1, you can see we've moved away from the wisdom language. Rather, here it's talking about fairness in a business setting. How about internal coherence that's achieved through thematic cohesion? You can see from the left where this is drawn from. Sequence of 5 verses in the middle, towards the end, actually, of chapter 11. The themes that are moving through here are desire and generosity. Some of the desire is good, some of it is not good. But desire or longing, and that's in the red, and generosity. Let's just pick out a few of those. So, verse 23, the core longing, that's desire, of moral folk is strictly good, and the hope, that's a sense of longing, isn't it? Of guilty folk is an angry outburst. Verse 24, there is one who scatters generously, so there's our generosity theme, and yet gains still more. That goes with this idea of desiring. While one holds back, that's a selfish attitude, desire or selfishness, holds back from straight dealing, surely winds up in want. That's desiring. So these two themes, desiring and generosity, really antithetical, aren't they? They're opposites. Weave through this in a very, very rich and cohesive way. Palistrophe, this is the imagery of climbing a mountain, pivoting, and then going back down again. These are the same verses that we saw the theme running through. Now, as we analyze what's the concept, not just individual words, but actually the concept, and that's what's suggested on the right, we can detect that the sage moves from 23, step up to 24, then pivots on 25, and then repeats himself, repeats some themes. It may be helpful to walk through this. In both parts of step 1, that's the blue zone, top and bottom, he's saying that what you hope happens to other people will determine what happens to you. In step 2, that's both of the beige ones, he's saying generosity wins while stinginess loses. And in the green zone, a single verse pivot. Here the sage unveils his stunning ideal for character formation, to cultivate within myself a longing, an appetite, not to satisfy my own desires, but to satisfy the needs of others. Let's just read that as it is on the left. Verse 25, an appetite for blessing others will itself be made fat. Just as one who waters thoroughly, meaning watering others, watering a plant, will himself be watered. If I were to hope for anything that you might take away from tonight, in terms of an inspiring phrase, it would be the start of that verse, an appetite for blessing others. Appetite by nature tends to be self-centered, doesn't it? I have an appetite. But here's the biblical ideal of an appetite. Having an appetite for blessing others. It makes me think of Genesis 20, when God called Abraham. Part of the wording in there that's retained in some versions, but not always, it's actually a command. Bless others. He says to Abraham, you are to be a blessing. You are to get about the business of blessing others. As Abraham goes by, there ought to be kind of a fragrance in the train. You know, people say, boy, I'm glad Abraham came my way. We could say that God was asking him to have an appetite for blessing others. What do I have an appetite for? It's very easy. Here we are in Holy Week, aren't we? Approaching Easter. So easy to see that Christ models this. He did this for us. He had an appetite for blessing, and he invites us to do the same. Incidentally, where was this in the palace trough? It's at the pinnacle. Again, our whole aim tonight is to learn to read Proverbs, particularly the chapters 10 to 29, where we're accustomed to just seeing isolated pearls. I can no longer read 11:25 as an isolated pearl. I see it as a gem at the summit of a mountain, this palistrophic mountain. It has been positioned as a gem in this setting that makes it, what shall we say, makes it gleam much more brightly, because we've been paying attention to the dynamic development of thought around it. I hope that makes sense. Here then is an example of the technique of a multiple theme introduction. Here we are at 11:28, 29, and 30. This is very near the end of this particular lecture or poem that we find here in Proverbs, end of 10 and 11. That poem, incidentally, if I were to give a title for it, I would call it, he's answering the question, what's the harm in fraudulent riches, getting rich illegally or immorally? What's the harm? And it's as if the pupil is asking that. And it's as if the sage then writes this poem, this lecture, to answer, what's the harm in it? And we find him saying there are problems that develop if a person accumulates wealth in a selfish manner, and yet how beautiful it is when he operates generously. So back to the idea of a multiple theme introduction. 28 gives both those two ideas, and then 29 will develop the first idea, 30 develops the second idea. First idea is greed. Whoever trusts in his riches, that one will fall. 28b, the second theme is generosity, while moral persons will sprout out like a leaf. Granted, from the language that you see right there, you may not notice generosity. And frankly, I'm overlaying that word generosity because of what the poem has, how it's associated moral persons with generous behavior earlier in the poem. So I want to admit I'm pulling that in from earlier in the poem, the connection between generosity and moral persons. 29 then expands on 28a, the idea of greed, one who entangles his household. And the concept here is, it can have the idea of financial entanglement. He will inherit, that's a richest word, right? A greed can be associated with greed. He will inherit wind, fool is servant to the wise of mind. 30 then expands on the beige zone, the generosity idea, where it says, the fruit of a moral person is a tree of life, and one who gains lives is wise. Verse 31 is the very end of the poem that began back in 10:31. I should say 11:31 is the end. And here we encounter a character summary. He writes, consider this, the moral person on earth will be repaid. How much more the guilty sinner? So the character traits that the sage, the poet, is wanting us to pay attention to, either to emulate or to avoid, are compressed. We don't get the entire lecture summarized. It's really a compression, and it's often a sense of moralization. Intensification. The underscored words, again, from some of these same closing lines we've already looked at, I believe they operate on a higher register. They're more, they punch a little more deeply. Tree of life, that's language it's reminiscent of paradise, of the Garden of Eden. And as soon as you use that language, it's like, oh my, we're going back to the start of things. We're going back to some original depth. The expression in 31, consider this. That's sort of like grabbing hold of the lapels of the person you're talking to. That's intense. And the expression, how much more? That's an extreme sort of expression. So we see the poet is ratcheting up the intensity of the expression as he's coming to the end. Didn't we use the idea of the end of a symphony, and suddenly the drums are banging and the brass is blaring, and the strings they're ringing their bows so much you think they're going to cut their violins in half. Closure operates also towards the end of this poem. This one might be a little bit more difficult to express, to communicate, but let me give it a try. These 4 verses, 28 through 31, they combine and form the 4th and final section of the poem that began back in 1031. These 4 sayings are peppered with various terms or topics that appeared earlier in the poem, resulting in closure. So I guess you'll just have to trust me for this, but feel free to check it out yourself. The words that involve closure then are underlined, and they surround several topics, 6 of them. One is misplaced confidence. Could be putting confidence in riches that have been illegally obtained. Positively, one of the concepts is valuing relationships. Something as specific as falling. It's in verse 28 here, and it showed up earlier in the poem, which is not displayed. Robust vitality, magnanimity, and retribution are other themes that all fold together. Think of it almost like someone who's weaving or braiding. They take threads of the various colors that they've used earlier in the tapestry, and they all pull them together towards the end. Once again, these are some of the techniques that show cohesive thought and progression in poems. I hope that through this kind of blitz through some of the poetic techniques that you'll come away with a sense that, yes, there are poems in the shallow material, Proverbs 1 through 9, but it looks like there are some poems when we get out in chapters 10 and following as well. And that's where we've been most recently. Now we'd like to turn our thought from what is it that characterizes a poem to how should I handle a single saying, a favorite proverb of mine? How can I get the greatest richness out of it? Aware that it has some tendrils or tentacles that spread out to adjacent sayings. Here's what I would suggest. What is useful in that task is to first notice the wider poem where that saying appears. Try to see where there's a beginning and the ending. The commentary that I've worked on, that's one of the contributions I've endeavored to make there. So if you're saying, how do I ever do that? Perhaps that resource would be useful, or you may find some that you'll show me that I didn't see, and that would be wonderful. And then notice the themes that are in that poem. So we're kind of studying the constellation around our favorite verse, and we're watching where's the poem and what's the sage been talking about, and then we shine that light down on our particular saying. We look location-wise, step 2, where does my saying land? So for example, what if your saying is the beginning of a poem, your favorite one that you're wanting to look at? Well, that would let you know it may be serving an introductory role. Or what if it's the very end? Then you'd want to be listening for the timpani. You'd want to be watching for the fireworks and say, oh, there might be a lot compressed into this that I hadn't realized. So we want to watch where in the poem is it located, and then how that particular favorite poem that or a saying that might contribute to where the poem overall is flowing, how the thought moves through it. Here's an example. We'll be looking at chapter 11, verse 30, which reads, the fruit of a moral person is a tree of life, and one who gains lives is wise. The wider poem, it's the one we've been sampling so far, starts in 1031 and goes through 1131. What kind of themes? It's dealing with getting things and how does the acquisition of things affect relationships. As far as the location of that poem, of this saying, we find that the target saying 1130 is next to last. Notice the poem ends in 1131 and we're looking at 1130. So it's the next to last saying. So there's stands a good chance that the poet is looking for ways to draw his thoughts together in a climactic fashion. Can't be guaranteed, but there's a good chance that might be going on. What does it contribute to the progression of thought? Being as it is, the saying is the lecture's very last example, that is, live this way. It shows how hearers should value relationships above material and other sorts of acquisition and invest generously in them. Here you can see that saying in its context. It leaves me with this sense, and I'm looking now at the bottom statement that I produced there in the green background, that Solomon is saying we should quest not after tangible wealth, but through acts of generous giving, we should quest to acquire lives. Notice that expression, he who gains lives. He's speaking to the acquisition theme, but he's saying don't waste your time just getting silver and gold and trinkets. Get lives. Now, given that the that earlier saying about how to treat people was an appetite for blessing. Remember that in 11:25, wasn't it? An appetite for blessing. We clearly know that this gaining of lives is nothing oppressive. It's not like owning people. It would be rather a sense of redeeming people. It would be building a rich web of community by valuing people, looking out for them. A few days ago, I was talking with an individual who was a skilled Christian counselor, and he was talking about the importance of eye contact. This individual, by the way, is just, he's just off the charts as far as eye contact. When you're talking with him, you have his undivided attention. He's gaining lives. He's conveying the worth. He's telling me that I matter to him by such a simple thing as eye contact. You know the opposite. It's the person who glances at you and then looks to see who else is in the room that they really hope they get to talk to before the reception is over. We know perhaps we've done that at times. He who gains lives is wise. Time out for just a little bit of astronomy. Are you familiar with the slingshot effect? Here's the concept. A spacecraft or a meteor or something like that, if it is traveling, I'm looking at the little three-legged three-pod item in the lower right. If it's traveling on this yellow path towards Jupiter, gets into Jupiter's gravitational pull, it can't keep going straight past it. Rather, it accelerates as the gravity of Jupiter grabs hold of it, and it slingshots around. And not only does it change its direction, but it accelerates it. The slingshot effect. Well, if we take that over and say, what can we learn about the effect of studying a single gem, that's our little spacecraft, a single saying, in the context of a big, massive poem that it belongs to, what happens is the orbit and the acceleration of the velocity of that little gem becomes magnified and intensified. And that's the way it was built to operate. As long as I limit myself to reading just gem after gem after gem with no sense of connectedness, I am not letting them enjoy their natural intended slingshot effect intensification as a result of being part of the orbit of a poem with all of the webs of connection. I wonder how many of us, if we were to ask what's your favorite saying from Proverbs, would say, trust in the Lord with all your heart. That's 3, 5, and 6. Here is the way this slingshot effect impacts a favorite saying like 3, 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean and depend on your own understanding. In all your ways, know him. He will direct your paths. Here's what's going on in the bigger picture. Now we're looking at multiple poems. When we read Proverbs 1 and 2, there's not a lot of life-specific advice. Oh, we could say, well, didn't Lady Wisdom say, please join, become my disciple? That's life's, well, yes, but can we acknowledge that that's actually a wisdom commendation? It's saying wisdom is worth going after. That's a kind of a recruitment and enrollment thing. So Proverbs 1 is a lengthy wisdom commendation. Proverbs 2 is also. It's saying, get wisdom, value wisdom above great jewels, because it'll protect you from this wicked person and that wicked person. Get wisdom. That's wisdom commendation. What we've just said is that there is no life-specific advice yet disclosed in all of Proverbs 1 or all of Proverbs 2. It's all the aroma telling us that a meal eventually will be served, but it's just the aroma. It's not until we get to Proverbs 3 that Solomon begins to give life-specific advice. In fact, he doesn't give it in the first 4 verses. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, this is still wisdom commendation. He does tip us off that it's going to be about relationships, human and divine. It's not until chapter 3, verse 5, that we encounter the very first wisdom content of the entire book. I hope you're picturing that. I think of it this way. Saturn V rocket, Cape Canaveral. Let's imagine it's a two-stage booster rocket. Stage 1 is Proverbs 1. Stage 2 is Proverbs 2. And a little bit of Proverbs 3, 1 through 4. But the payload up there at the top that it's all of that rocket power is pushing is Proverbs 3, 5. That is the most important. That's the in a sense, the pearl of great price, to borrow from another wisdom piece that Jesus used. Consequently, it's so appropriate that verse 5 of chapter 3 would be a favorite of yours, because it was a favorite of Solomon's. And we can tell that by looking at the multiple poem sequence in this case. Finally, book wide. We saw this image earlier. The concept here is that as we study the kinds of advice that are delivered in certain sections of Proverbs, it looks like it's a staged curriculum. So that the first 9 chapters are largely recruitment and also giving some basic wisdom information. Chapters 10 to 24 are giving a little more elevated. He spends less time trying to recruit because the recruitment has been successful. And consequently, he's giving more specific advice, but of a basic sort, to help this young person become a leader in the community. That changes when we get to chapter 25 to 29. The kinds of advice that Solomon's and the Hezekiah editors, as it's referred to there, that they are giving, is advice for someone who is already a leader in the community. In fact, the king, the monarch, is one of the ones addressed there. When finally we come to 30 and 31, it's like review. It's advice as basic as revere the Lord. We started that with chapter 1. And as sophisticated as targeted information for a king, so that he will lead well and not dissipate his resources in a loose fashion. What are these blue pillars? These are authorial notices. The wisdom, or the Proverbs of Solomon, 1:1, 10:1, the Proverbs of Solomon, 25:1, Solomon's Proverbs that Hezekiah's team reworked, 30, verse 1, the sayings of Agur, and we also have King Lemuel's mother, beginning of 31. So these are authorial notices that are kind of like the signposts to say we're changing into a separate topic. Consequently, there may be good reason to understand the book-wide aim as a curriculum that tracks and trains sages for the next generation. And there's a sense of escalating capabilities of the students, just like you would if you were teaching people. I trust the takeaway from this, there'll be a sense that there are poems that surround the individual sayings, even in 10 through 29. And we can learn to recognize those as we get used to how the sages would build poems in the shallow waters of Proverbs 1 through 9. As a result, we can interpret single sayings more richly and even begin to appreciate that multiple poem sequences can show a curricular trajectory for the training that's found in the book of Proverbs. I would agree that with Wolfgang Meter, that when it's merely in a collection, that is to say, like spices on a rack, a proverb is dead. It hasn't been put into a recipe yet. But I don't think that's what's going on in the book of Proverbs. We don't have sayings in a collection. What we have rather is a constellation. And that wraps up the things that I wish to prepare. Would be delighted to respond to any questions or ideas that others may have.
Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question. I haven't seen any appear in the chat, so anybody would like, go ahead. It's good. You answered everything as they were going along. Just a reminder, if you do have questions, the authoritative source is, again, a recommendation, Paul's commentary. But are there any questions that folks might have?
See, the Millers have a hand up. Nice to see you, folks. How are you? Maybe that's my hand.
Dr. Overland, this is George. How are you?
George.
Thanks for this presentation. It does seem to enrich the reading, certainly of Proverbs. I'm wondering, did you see this, or did you have any opportunity to see this same kind of patterning and working in any of the other ancient Near Eastern comparative wisdom literature at all?
Great question, George. Yes. In particular, an Egyptian composition that dates probably around 1200 BC. And by saying that, it's earlier than Solomon by a couple of centuries. The wisdom of Amenemope. So back that far, we find the persons interested in transmitting wisdom, like Proverbs. Persons interested in transmitting wisdom to their families or the next generation were already writing chapters. That is to say, they were writing poems, they were writing theme cohesive sequences of sayings, as opposed to just a bucket of pearls. Yeah, so we definitely see evidence of cohesive poems that would be earlier than the composition in the Hebrew Bible.
Interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. What makes that sequence, that chronology, significant is that in the scholarship of Proverbs over the decades, and now I'm thinking back to scholars who were writing towards the beginning of the 20th century, the assumption was that it was, I guess you'd say, an evolutionary skill. That is to say, the first wisdom compositions they presumed were simple, solitary, isolated. And then as they assumed that as the sages got more skilled, then they were capable of writing longer poems, wisdom poems. So isolated sayings, like folk sayings, and then as they got better at it, then it'd be longer. Consequently, the tendency was to look at Proverbs and say the poems that are in 1 through 9, they'd say, okay, those are late. Why? Because they're long. And people didn't know how to do long wisdom poems early. So what they thought were simply isolated sayings in 10 to 29, say those were early and the others were late. Well, then we come across Amenemope, and he's been writing long wisdom poems 200 years before. So can you see how this it changed the paradigm, or at least it should, change the paradigm of what we thought was possible in terms of wisdom composition and the sophistication of it.
So maybe just a piggyback question on that too. So is it presumed that these longer workings, these longer poems or longer sections are the work of all one author, or has this person brought together other individual sayings to convey a specific message in this compilation?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So that's an interesting question. And so the way we best ascertain whether or not he's borrowing earlier material is if somewhere it was attested So, for example, we've got those are called epigrams. So, if we can find that one epigram within Proverbs was attested elsewhere, that would really help. We do have proverbial expressions outside of Proverbs. I'm not aware of any within Proverbs that are tested outside. I may be overlooking something. But we have riddles. We have Samson and his riddles. That would be wisdom type material. Is it Jotham? There's some parables. These are wisdom type things that we do find in the narrative portions of the Hebrew Bible. So we know it was out there. Right. So my sense of this is that, number one, without external attestation of an individual saying, having had a life of its own before it wound up in Proverbs, without any attestation of that, my sense is, who am I to say? So I guess we have to say, I don't know. So we presume that it was originated with the author of Proverbs, but no guarantee of that. Let's see, one footnote that I should add relative to, now this will link back to the Amenemope material. In chapters 22 to 25, as I'm sure, George, you're aware, there are some sayings that have remarkable similarity to the certain Egyptian ones. They have been adapted. We could even say sanitized. The theology of the Nile culture has been changed so it fits the theology of Israel. So that might be our best example of externally attested sayings that then have been wonderfully adapted. They're not just thrown in willy-nilly, but they fit within the Hebrew sages' poems.
Oh, very good. Well, thank you again, Dr. Overland, for your work in this and for the presentation. It certainly does enrich our reading of Proverbs. That's a good thing. Thank you.
Glad you were here tonight, George.